Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And it is the final episode in our Dystopian series. What a trip it's been, James. What a journey through sci-fi it's been.
Yeah, it's been quite a trip. It's been an eventful one, to say the least. We've gone through some crazy dystopian worlds on our Journey Through Sci-Fi this series. It's been depressing, it's been joyful, it's been exciting, it's been rebellious. It's been a lot of things, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad you said joyful. I'm just trying to remember what bits were joyful. You know, this has without a doubt been the heaviest series we've done so far, because this is a heavy topic, dystopias. But regardless of how heavy it is, as we do at the end of each series, we are going to be looking back on some of the best films that we talked about this series and doing our now traditional Dystopian Journey Through Sci-Fi Awards show. So we're going to be handing out some awards to the various categories that we've picked out for all of the films and TV shows that we've looked at. And there's been loads of them, hasn't there?
Yeah, we've covered a grand total of 40 films this series and 2 TV series, which were The Handmaid's Tale and our usual Star Trek special, which we throw in every series on the show. And it's been such a large amount of films for this topic, for this subgenre to delve into. It's been really interesting. They've all been quite different as well, but they've had certain strands which have continued throughout. And also, this is our longest series. This is our 24th episode in our look on Dystopia. So, yeah, big numbers this series.
Is this our longest series?
Yeah, it's our longest one. And we've covered, like, our time travel, I think, was the next longest one we've done in the past. Okay. And AI was, I think, 17 episodes. So, but yeah, this is the 24th episode of our Dystopian series. So, yeah, a lot.
Woo! Been a big one. Well, James, shall we open the doors and let the enormous crowd that we've got waiting outside into the arena so that we can start this awards ceremony in earnest?
Yes, let in the rabble and let's get going. Welcome to the Dystopian Film Awards. We're very happy you've all been able to join us on this monumentous occasion. We have 8 categories for you. And what is our first category, Matt?
The first category this evening, or whenever you're listening to this podcast, is the best dystopian protagonist, the hero of the piece who leads the story, who drives the story, rebelling against the dystopian government or not, as the case may be, but really leading the charge in these dystopian stories. Who are our nominees, James?
So we have Katniss Everdeen from Hunger Games. We've got Winston Smith from 1984. We've got Alex from A Clockwork Orange. We've got Vincent Freeman from Gattaca. And we've got June from Handmaid's Tale. Ooh, there's some big protagonists in that list.
There's a good bunch, yeah. I mean, Katniss Everdeen, I'm leaning away from Katniss, if I'm going to be honest with you, James. She really, she leads that story, but she doesn't have a lot of personality, to be honest with you.
I think she gets better in the rest of the series, bit by bit, but I do know what you mean. She's not taking the helm from the start, is she? She's kind of thrown into it all. So, when you look at the other people in this list, she might not be the one that gets the award tonight.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the other people, we've got Winston Smith in there, an iconic character of literature from George Orwell's novel 1984 and the movie adaptation we watched, played wonderfully by the inimitable John Hurt, but he's a bit gloomy, isn't he?
Yeah, and he does go through it in that film as well, all of the stuff that happens to him, the infamous Room 101, all of the sort of torture that happens to him, physical and mental torture he goes through. He's definitely a protagonist which, goes through the wars, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, but, we've got other names on this list who are put through the wars in their stories, James. So next on the list was Alex from A Clockwork Orange. He's certainly got his share of war stories and torture inflicted upon him in A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, but he also dishes out quite a lot of the violence, doesn't he, at the same time?
Yes, he is a genuinely horrible son of a bitch. But as far as protagonists go, as we discussed when we did that episode, he's incredibly compelling and genuinely entertaining, but just intensely unlikable.
He's very stylish as well. The amazing costumes that they have in A Clockwork Orange, definitely something which I will be wearing around town at some point in the future. And we've also got Vincent Freeman from Gattaca. Again, a protagonist who really goes through it throughout the film. He is doing everything he can to be able to be part of the society and live out his dream of getting into space and not be judged for his genetic disposition.
Yeah, I really like Vincent. He's also not super likable, but compelling. He is like he's a much less horrible Alex from A Clockwork Orange, because he's quite tricky and deceptive, and he'll push the lines of what's acceptable behaviour, but he doesn't rape or murder anyone. I wouldn't put him in the same camp as Alex.
He's got that going for him, hasn't he?
I really like Vincent. I think he's like a bit of a James Bond in a dystopia.
You're just thinking about all the stuff he goes through, like putting the contacts and like having to shed his skin every day in that weird little box that he was in. All of those really extreme measures, like the fake fingerprints, like when he's having a piss test as well and having to fake that, all of this sort of like weird prosthetic stuff. He's kind of like James Bonding it up a little bit with all of his weird gadgets.
Yeah. Well, what about the last one then? June, aka Offred, from The Handmaid's Tale. Real hero who goes through quite a lot, as we've seen so far, and I expect we'll go through more incredibly awful stuff as more seasons of that show are made.
Yeah, I think she's such a great character as well, because she's like realistic, and you can see where her, like, everything about her performance works in with the character, because she has really been through it. Again, another character really going through it in this dystopian society, but June's also intensely relatable, and you see her going through all of these horrendous things and the mistreatment that her and the rest of the handmaids are sort of subjected to throughout the series, but she's able to sort of rally against it. And for me, she's kind of like the epitome of the protagonist going against the society and keeping that sort of like spirit of rebellion alive.
And there's something in it being a TV series, so you learn so much more about the dystopia than you do in films, and it also gives scope for that protagonist to just drive literally more plots, more hours of on-screen story. Well, who are you leaning towards, James? Who would you give the award to?
I think my sort of passionate talking about June from Handmaid's Tale kind of like makes me lean towards her. But also, like, there's something about Alex from A Clockwork Orange. Like, even though he's an absolute bastard, it's like two opposite ends of the spectrum almost, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. My head is saying June, but I have to say my heart is saying Vincent from Gattaca. I really like the James Bond aspect to him. But I feel like we're both kind of really compelled by June's story and feeling like she's the natural fit for this, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, congratulations then to June from A Handmaid's Tale, our best dystopian protagonist.
This can't have been for nothing.
I've made my decision.
It's not your decision. Men. Fucking pathological. You are not in charge. I am.
Oh, the crowd is so amazing here tonight. Listen to that applause. Absolutely
It's
brilliant.
wonderful. I could do with them to actually just dial it down a little bit, because we're just, we've got work.
Yeah, it's only the first category as well, guys.
Yeah.
So come on. So to keep things rolling, our next category is most absurd dystopian society. What a category that is.
Yeah, we've looked at some really ridiculous situations that our characters have, that society has found itself in. But the top four that we've picked for the nominations today are The Lobster, High Rise, Zardoz, and Death Race 2000.
Wow.
What a bunch.
Absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd stuff in there. But I love all of these films as well, just thinking about it. These were like, they were very entertaining in a otherwise quite dark series. I think I had a lot of fun watching these ones.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I enjoyed two of these significantly more than the other two.
In what way do you mean, Matt? In what way could you possibly mean?
I'm glad I watched all of them, but there's only two of them that I intend to watch again. Actually,
Wow.
I can see you, me, and a few of our friends watching Zardoz together over a few beers in the future.
Yeah, okay, I can guess what the other one is then. So let's run these ones down then. So, The Lobster from our postmodern dystopian episode. This film was such an interesting concept. But it was sort of like, I remember you talking about this in the episode, that it's got this kind of MacGuffin of people getting turned into animals if they don't find a partner. But that's probably the most absurd thing about the film. But then it's all the relationship stuff, and then sort of like having to navigate relationships in that society. It's got a lot of interesting themes and sort of like quite on the nose metaphors and stuff that they're talking about in that film. But what were your thoughts on that one?
Well, yeah, same. I mean, it's like it's on the one hand, it's a completely natural choice for this category because it's so absurd they were turning into animals. But as you said, like that is just a MacGuffin, and everything else about it is completely non-absurd. And it's played so straight that it feels incredibly realistic, doesn't it? But you've got this kind of turning into animals concept. Just not even in the back of your mind, it's at the front of your mind, like throughout the whole film, but it never actually comes to pass. It's just it's a MacGuffin, like I said.
And I think it's something about the scenarios that the characters end up in that film, and just the way they talk to each other. It's all very sort of like stilted and brief, and the whole communication aspect of that is like another thing that leans into the absurd nature of it. So I think that's definitely a contender in this category.
Yeah, I think that kind of surreal nature of communication also applies to the second film here, High Rise. And we paired these films together in the episode when we did them because they do have a lot of similarities in that sense. It's another film where it's just everything feels just slightly off. That's the absurdity of High Rise, isn't it? Everything's just a little bit skewed off center and doesn't feel right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's something about the way that it pokes fun at sort of like middle to upper class, having them all stay in this building when they could quite easily leave, and they never do. They're just so obsessed with living in this place, even when it becomes an absolute tip. It's just like burning and like all of this stuff going on in that crazy apartment.
Yeah, all of the weirdness is underscored by that central absurdity that they could leave at any time and flat out refuse to. That's the core absurdity of High Rise, isn't it?
But they love it. They love that high-rise apartment that they're in.
They do. James, what would you say is the core absurdity of the film Zardoz?
I mean, that's quite a question, Matt. I mean, one of the most absurd things is Sean Connery's costume.
Is it Sean Connery's costume, or is it the big stone head?
Or is it what the big stone head says to everyone in his big speech about...
Oh, yeah. What does he say? The penis is good. No, the penis is bad? I can't remember.
The penis is bad. The gun is good.
The gun is good. That was it. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the crazy, like Zardoz himself with his little crazy little goatee, his curly little goatee and floating head scene at the beginning.
His goatee, which was drawn on, which I don't think we actually talked about in the episode.
That, and then Sean Connery wearing a wedding dress at one point, and then the sort of the guy who's like half old and half young.
Yeah, I forgot a lot of this stuff.
And the amazing scene where he's punching through this shield, which is actually just a piece of plastic. It's got a lot of absurd stuff.
Yeah. The unbreakable plastic material, yeah. I'll just say, like, Sean Connery in a dress speaks for itself, and a big stone head speaks for itself. The guy who's half old, for any of our listeners that haven't listened to that episode, he's half old like Harvey Two-Face.
Yes.
Just as a reference point. Like, the left-hand side of him is like an old man. Just so you can picture that if you hadn't caught Zardoz yet, and you absolutely should.
Yeah, if you haven't, what are you guys doing? I know Matt said that he wasn't sure if he would watch this film again.
it's a must see once. It's like Requiem for a Dream, Green Room, Zardoz, the big three.
Wow.
You've got to see them. You've got to see them once, and you won't want to watch them again.
Would you watch them in that order so it gets progressively less hardcore?
No, put Zardoz in the middle as like a little palate cleanser.
Wow, what a triple bill that would be. And speaking of double bills and triple bills and whatnot, we had a lovely conversation with Kevin Lyons about this next film, Death Race 2000, which he caught at a double bill, didn't he? Way back in the day with Enter the Dragon, I think it was.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and this film, Death Race 2000, is mental. It's wacky races with violence. And I had a lot of fun watching this one. Like, it was great.
Yeah, it's wild. You've got Sylvester Stallone in there just being a weird creep. You've got David Carradine in there, also being a weird creep, but he's faking being a weird creep, I think.
In his big bondage suit as well.
The big bondage suit, yeah. And, of course, the iconic scoring system for hitting pedestrians that I think we talked about with Kev, that it's bled into like social consciousness of people who haven't even seen the film.
Yeah.
They know about the scoring system, you know.
That's it. And it's just like everything about that film, like even the society and the fact that they do this massive death race each year and people crowd around the TV screens to watch it. And there's like all of that stuff about the president and sort of the weird stuff that's going on with the government in that. It's just, again, a very absurd film, but great.
So what's your pick for this one? I was about to say this is quite hard, but then I remembered one of the films.
Well, I think as it is most absurd, I mean, if we're talking about like great films which I'd watch again, I would put The Lobster.
We're not talking
that's
about
like my most absurd one, which I would watch again. But I think most absurd, it's got to be Zardoz, hasn't it? It's the most bizarre film ever.
A maniacal piece of filmmaking. Zardoz. Yeah, brilliant in its own way. Definitely the most absurd dystopian society on film.
Yes, Zardoz, congratulations. You can take this award off in your floating head and have a lovely time.
The gun is good.
The gun is good.
The penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men. Zardoz has spoken.
So our next category is the most thought-provoking dystopia. So should we just pull back the curtain a bit and reveal that we renamed this from our most depressing dystopia was the original title for this, and we decided that was way too bleak. But these films are depressing, but incredibly thought-provoking, and that's why they're so depressing. And that's why we wanted to talk about them and pick the most thought-provoking one. So what are our contenders for this one, James?
So our contenders for this category are The Handmaid's Tale, Never Let Me Go, Children of Men, and 1984.
Some heavy hitters here on there. I mean, we've already talked a fair bit about June's journey in A Handmaid's Tale, but the society itself there is, you know, we talked with Tiffany Angus about how scary it is, didn't we? And how realistic it feels.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously the events from the time we're recording the last few weeks have made it even more thought-provoking and
absolutely
painfully relevant to what's going on in the world at the moment. And again, we talked to Tiffany about that when we did that episode on The Handmaid's Tale, but it really did make me think as well, because we talked about how difficult it is to watch that series at times because it is so kind of like relatable, and you can see how a society could get to that place, which is what makes it so scary and quite hard to watch.
Yeah, definitely. So Never Let Me Go was another quite difficult to watch one. I think for me this was like the saddest film. We've had depressing films, but this was just openly saddening. It is a film that is designed to make you feel sad for the characters, about the characters, and about the world they live in. This was but I don't even know if I would say it was a hard watch. not in the same way that Handmaid's Tale is and other films. You know, there's something quite joyful about watching a film this sad, but it was incredibly sad to watch, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the difference is Never Let Me Go is it's very moving in the story that it's telling, and it's very focused on a very small, contained group of characters who are all sort of stuck in this kind of like love triangle, and the relationships they have as they grow up. You see them from like sort of like being kids to teenagers to adults, and all of the stuff that happens in their lifespan, and also the fact that their lifespan is so painful. It's like it's cut short in a very painful way due to what's happening in the dystopian society. So I think that one really got me thinking as well, and just sort of like, we talked to Alan Stroud about this one, didn't we? And we talked about the sort of the genetic aspect of that dystopia, and just how if cloning were a thing, could you get to a point where people were being used in this way as basically just like spare parts for the other people in society? And yeah, it's very, I think moving is the word, isn't it? It's very emotional.
Yeah, very emotional. But so was the next film on the list, Children of Men, another incredibly emotional film, and also very exciting, action-packed movie at the same time. But thought-provoking in the sense that, again, it feels like a world that we could be heading towards. There's, similar to A Handmaid's Tale, there's this sort of issue with population that's happened, which is a sort of sci-fi or fantastical element, but beyond that it feels very realistic in a similar way to A Handmaid's Tale. You can believe that we are just one catastrophic event away from slipping into the world of Children of Men.
Yeah, so listeners, you can see why we almost called this most depressing category, because like even just talking about it is like, it's quite a lot. But yeah, Children of Men I think is definitely worthy of being in this list because it is thought-provoking. It gets you thinking about sort of like what would happen if this scenario happened, if this scenario came to pass. And like we've looked at sort of like overpopulation, underpopulation throughout the series, and I think the way that Children of Men does it is so interesting because a lot of the fears which happened throughout our series as well, like when we looked at overpopulation, that was such a big part of a certain set of dystopian films and themes, and then underpopulation, the reverse of that, is just like I think it's more terrifying in a way because there's nothing that the human race can do about it if that came to pass. So like they're doing all these extreme measures in these overpopulation films, but in Children of Men, it's all about like, well, what if we can't continue as a race? And then are we even worthy of continuing as a race given some of the stuff that we're doing faced with this problem?
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. But so is the last film on this list, 1984. Been a bit of a bedrock of our conversation this series, and another very thought-provoking film. Less close, I think, than some of the other films because it's set in a world that was supposed to be quite distant, from the time it was written.
The 80s.
But from the late 40s when it was written.
Course. It's not the 80s that we know now.
No, very much so. And it's a lot bleaker and less colourful than the 80s that we remember from television shows about the 80s. But that bleakness is I think what makes it such a heavy watch, right? Like just the kind of the bombed out cities that Winston exists in and is trying to experience love in, and can love flourish in a deeply dystopian society, very oppressive dystopian society like this.
Yeah, and I think 1984 basically informed the rest of our series, didn't it, when we looked at it? It just brought so much to the table, which we continuously referenced throughout. But I think 1984 for me, like, it is thought-provoking, but it's more to do with how it's setting out a dystopia, and it sort of teaches you... It teaches early lessons about how dystopian societies could look, and then it sort of goes from there, and then you see it twisted and sort of molded into different ways in different films, all taking that sort of 1984 kind of aesthetic almost as well. It's kind of got all of that element in there. Yeah,
I agree. It's very hard to deny its power as a thought-provoking dystopian film, because of its influence. More the book, because the book came so much earlier than the film, but the film is, a very, very good and very faithful adaptation of the book. So I think you can sort of lump it in there with that legacy of the book. Unless
we forget that Matt read the book in record time before that episode of the podcast as well. He speed read it in about a day, didn't you? It was crazy.
I did, yeah. So what's your pick for the most thought-provoking dystopia?
Well, I've had to think about this, surprisingly enough. But
were your thoughts provoked, James?
They were provoked, yes. I think for me, it's got to be Handmaid's Tale, just because of how relevant it is, and it's in my mind at the moment. So I think for me, it's that one.
Yeah, definitely. There's a bit of we can acknowledge there's a bit of a recency bias in that, like, the topics that Handmaid's Tale gets into are unfolding in the news at the time of recording, particularly in America, or specifically in America. But that says a lot when you're talking about dystopian fiction, doesn't it? If the things that dystopian fiction is warning us about are coming to pass, then that's troubling for sure. But it makes the work more thought-provoking in the present day.
And it keeps the conversation alive, doesn't it? Because it's telling you certain things, like, this is where we could be heading if we don't watch out for what's happening now, and if we're not in uproar about what's happening. Because if you just let if you let things go, then you can't move forward, and we could end up in a society like that. That's what really made me think about it all.
Yes, so that is our most thought-provoking dystopia. It's the TV series Handmaid's Tale.
You girls will serve the leaders of the faithful and their barren wives. You will bear children for them. Oh, you are so lucky! So privileged!
Welcome to the friggin' loony bin, right?
Okay, next up, we're looking at the most despicable government ever to be in a dystopian society. And what are the nominees for this one, Matt?
So we've got Battle Royale, Dread, Soylent Green, and The Purge.
Oh, it's very violent and killy, isn't it, all of this stuff?
It's the violent and killy ones. Yeah, that's what we've labelled up as despicable. I mean, you could fit in so many of the films we've covered. That's kind of the point of dystopian fiction, isn't it? Is that the government is despicable. And we've just talked about how awful things are in the depressing, thought-provoking films. And they have some pretty despicable actions from the government. But not to repeat the nominees from that. These are the ones that are just outwardly just violent and just destroying their population. So, I mean, Battle Royale, one of the best that we looked at this series, a favourite of all of ours that we're talking about, that you, me and Mike. A great movie, but what a horrible set of politicians at the top, just decreeing the enforced battle to the death of children across the country of Japan.
Yeah, and I think we agreed when we were talking about that film that we all felt for these students which had ended up in this situation, because like they're just suddenly thrown onto an island and then made to kill each other, and that is the epitome of despicable, surely.
Yeah, and it's all about, because we feel for those kids, it makes the film all about the human cost of the Battle Royale Act, the actual, the governmental operations that brought about their situation. And we talked about how melodramatic it is, didn't we? But how that works so well in the context of the film and just makes you feel more for these kids that are being put through it.
Exactly. I think it's got a lot going for it in Battle Royale. And even though you don't see this despicable government, you get a real sense of them, because they're kind of like, there's stuff going on in our society, let's just chuck the kids away and let them sort themselves out. And it sort of distracted the rest of society as well. I think it's also just the way they spin the Battle Royale itself as well. Just like they've got little TV reports of it, and it almost seems like something that's supposed to be good for the society, but it's not, is it? I mean, how can it be?
Like the government has passed this brutal, violent act, and then they're saying like it's fixing all our problems with like unemployment and stuff like that.
And another film which has a despicable government where it's got exactly that. You've got a government putting down laws which are supposed to be helping people, but they're actually quite fascist, aren't they? And I think that would be Dredd, wouldn't it? They've got a despicable government there.
Yeah, totally despicable government. And we talked about this in the episode, but what makes the film so great is the way that Dredd is the hero of the piece, and you're completely on side with this iron fist of a fascist government. And we talked on Patreon, didn't we? We did an episode where we looked at a documentary about the history of 2000 AD, where it came from. We learned a little bit more there as well, about the kind of context around the wider Dredd universe. But it's just a great bit of filmmaking, isn't it, to bring us on side with Dredd, but he's also completely despicable, like Alex from A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a few characters like that throughout the series. Like even thinking about like the Warriors as well, there were certain aspects of those characters which were not good at all and were a bit despicable. But it's kind of like, what's going on in the society to make these characters like that? But with Dredd, you've got someone who is in law enforcement and is going after the drug dealers and the people which are causing quite despicable things to happen in the tower blocks that they're living in and causing other people harm. So it kind of looks on the surface that he's doing something for good, but there's more to it.
Yeah, but there's very carefully placed that scene early on where there's a homeless guy in the building that they're going into, and Dredd basically has to say, like, it's illegal to be homeless, but I'm here to deal with something else, but I will be coming back. He does a judgment on the homeless guy, which is horrible, and he does it very offhandedly and quickly. But he's got more pressing matters to attend to. That's very carefully placed in there by the filmmakers to make us aware that, like, yeah, for the majority of the film, he's going to be going after a really nasty piece of work in Lena Headey. But he's also a big piece of shit, and we just happen to catch him on a day where he's dealing with a bigger piece of shit. He will be horrible to people who don't deserve it in his day-to-day life.
Yeah, but there is something just about his character that is just...
But he's so cool, yeah. Another awful government then in these films that we've looked at is the government of Soylent Green, who are literally liquidating the public and turning them into food, James.
I mean, that's despicable, isn't it? Like, who would do that? It's terrible. Although we did have a long conversation about what you would do in an overpopulated society and, like, how could they solve that problem? I mean, turning people into food is never going to be the best outcome.
I seem to remember that I ended up being weirdly sympathetic to the decision to turn people into Soylent Green. I can't even remember how I got myself into that.
It was the euthanasia places that I think.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, you've got to give it to them, James. As depicted on screen, we don't know if this is like sort of true across society, but the only actual Soylent Green development we see is through the voluntary euthanasia. So it's actually, it's a circular economy, James.
Circular economy. Another possible future, of course, is The Purge. I'm hoping The Purge never happens because I don't know that I would do very well in The Purge, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I straightforwardly cannot afford the good home defense systems as depicted in the film. I don't live in a community like Ethan Hawke does. And shout out to Ethan Hawke again. This podcast, this series, and our time travel series, and I think we might have seen him in other series as well. I've really become a huge fan of Ethan Hawke. That's why my heart was going towards Vincent in Gattaca earlier this episode. I bloody love Ethan Hawke. Anyway.
Ethan Hawke is great. And if you haven't seen it already, you should check out The Black Phone. It's not sci-fi.
I have not seen that.
It's older Ethan Hawke making a comeback, and it's great.
Oh, it's his new horror movie, isn't it? Is that good? It looks awful. The poster looks dreadful.
It's good. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Okay.
But I thoroughly enjoy a lot of films, Matt, that you don't get on with, so...
that's true. Ethan Hawke's a big ticket for me. I feel like I'd watch anything with him.
He's good. Yeah, one for the Ethan Hawke fans. But sticking to The Purge, it's definitely the despicable government. Why would you make it so that everyone could do whatever they want one day of the year, And I always refer to it as blowing off steam, but it's more than that. It's like...
Blowing off heads, James.
Yeah, fucking hell. It's like we could do whatever we want. We can rob people, we can kill people, we can rape people. It's fine. It's fine for this one day.
And what's interesting about this film is that we're introduced to the case for the purge, this idea that it's going to solve society's problems. And that's compelling in a sense, like that if you were sort of given that option, you can understand why a society might move towards that if it worked. But then we get these hints to sort of the other kind of extreme right-wing fundamentalist nature of the government, the kind of cultish behaviour that's cultivated with the lovely little... is it like blue flowers that they have to leave out? And if you haven't left out the blue flowers, you're in the wrong, and there's this sort of societal pressure and stuff. It's very like cult-like behaviour in society that tells you just a little bit more about the type of government that's got in and enacted this Purge Act.
Oh, yeah. This category is going to be a hard one for me. Just thinking about that stuff you just said about the Purge. Which one are you leaning towards at the moment?
For me, because we did a little bit of extra kind of reading around 2000 AD and the context of Dredd, for me it's Dredd. Just how interesting it is that the kind of heroic, cool character is like a brute force weapon of an evil fascist government that makes him a compelling character to watch, and also at the same time, simultaneously, the arm of the law in a brutal dystopian government. I find that a really interesting concept. Yeah, that's why I'm leaning towards it. I really want to see more of that universe on film as depicted in that film. So that's why I'm leaning towards that. How about you?
Yeah, I'm quite drawn on this one because Battle Royale and The Purge both have the same thing going on, don't they? You've got large groups of society being put in scenarios where they have to kill each other, or they don't have to, but that's what they like to do. And yeah, Dredd is just like a different kind of despicable government. And I think like initially I wasn't drawn to Dredd as sort of like a potential winner for this, just because just thinking about Dredd, the film itself, I feel like you don't get enough of that idea about what the government's like from that film alone.
Well, arguably you don't get an idea of the government in any of these films. We know one act that the government has put into law in Battle Royale and The Purge, and Soylent Green, the sort of production of Soylent Green. We see, but in Dredd, I mean, he's a federal officer. He's a representative of the government. He's not a government agent or a government official or anything like that. But the police are a public service, so they're lumped in with, they're affected by government policy. They exist because of government policy, and the way they enforce the law is because of government policy. And that's true in the real world. And it's true in Dredd as well.
And they've got that whole dirty cops section, haven't they, in the film?
Sure, yeah.
So that's another aspect of it.
So we see all this corruption that's happening, and we've seen a lot of corruption across this series, and we get a little taste of that in Dredd as well. So we know they're kind of lumped in with that. I don't think we see much government corruption in any of the other films, because corruption's even like, the government's despicable in these films, but then they're also corrupt. It's like, come on guys, like at least stick to your own rules, even though they're awful and horrible.
I mean, of course, the other despicable government, which could have thrown into this one, would have been like 1984 with Big Brother and all the sort of like the stuff that's going on there. So I think when you look at that kind of thing, I think for me, throwing that sort of aspect of it and just sort of the Big Brothery kind of element, I think the closest film that has that kind of thing to it would be Dredd. So I think I'm going to go with your decision, and I'm going to give Dredd this award.
Oh God, that was really tense, James. I'm glad I won you over. God, that was really important to me. Well done, Dredd, the most despicable government in a dystopian film.
You too, Dredd, you're despicable.
But we love you.
But we love you.
This is Judge Dredd. In case you people have forgotten, this block operates under the same rules as the rest of the city. Mama is not the law. I am the law.
Our next category is for the best rebellion. We're getting a bit more hopeful now and a bit more like rallied up, right? So the films where a group comes together and tries to take down those despicable governments. So what are our nominees, James?
So for best rebellion, we have Hunger Games, Akira, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, and Brazil.
Oh, so we're back to Katniss Everdeen with Hunger Games.
Your favourite or not favourite, because you think she's a bit bland.
I do find her a bit bland as a character, but I can't deny how iconic the movement that she inspires is with the little whistly, what is it? The little Mockingjay whistle that they do.
Yeah,
and
I can't whistle, so I can't do it. I'll just put in a little sound effect here.
Oh, that's it. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
And the little salute that they do as well.
Throughout
that's
this
great.
call, Matt has been doing that salute whilst he's been doing that little bit of conversation there.
Yeah, I podcast with my hands. I'm not a fan of Katniss, but I am a fan of the movement that she inspires, the Mockingjay movement.
Yeah, and it does turn out to be a good rebellion in the end after the trilogy of films. It does sort of like it really ramps up. There's a few twists and turns along the way, but yeah, I think it's a good rebellion.
And then we have Akira, of course. So we've got Kaneda at the centre of it, who's kind of just bouncing around in a kind of farcical way, but he gets wrapped up in this rebellion movement who are trying to take down the government and also free the ESP kids as well, I think, aren't they? Or is that just part of their plan to take down the government?
I think when we talked about Akira, it was kind of like it was difficult to figure out exactly what the rebellion's motives were. I think we came to the conclusion that they were basically trying to get the ESP kids out of the government's hands because they're weapons, basically. So that was kind of like the rebellious motives. But it didn't seem as organised as some of the other rebellions I've seen in other dystopian films.
It's not very organised, but they are so important in that film for like facilitating Kaneda's journey, arming him with a big laser cannon, basically, and that's important for taking down the systems that are in place because everything just gets like blown up at the end, and it's more Kaneda, but the rebellion there kind of like facilitates and empowers him on his journey.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. But I think the next film we've got in this category, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, one of my faves because the Planet of the Apes film, as we've discussed on Patreon over the last few months. But yeah, Conquest it's got the big ape rebellion, and you see the apes being treated like absolute shit. They're like slaves, they're servants, they're doing all of the sort of like the jobs which the human society just doesn't want to do anymore. And yeah, just seeing that uprising at the end, it's very violent and full on, but yeah, there's something about that rebellion which I really enjoyed. And
it's the film that really sets the scene for the Planet of the Apes, isn't it? It's the film that gets us transitioning from the prequel sort of timeline of the original Planet of the Apes films and transitions us towards the original film. We have to see this moment where the apes take over the world, and Conquest is the film that does that. So the only sort of like problem with this is it's really compelling, but we talked about this when we covered it, how frustrating and disappointing the ending is, where all of that momentum behind Caesar just kind of like crumbles because they re-edited the ending of the film, and the rebellion, such as it is, well, he kind of just like stops it, right? It's on this like Paul Atreides-esque wave to take over the world that's unstoppable, and then Caesar just kind of gives a speech and he's like, oh, that's enough, no more killing.
Yeah, I think that was the shame about the film, but I still think about sort of how it's gone on to shape the other Planet of the Apes films, like Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It's got the big sort of like rebellion scene there where they sort of like all break out of the, they break the other apes out of the zoos and out of the labs, and that they sort of like charge away. They're fighting the police on the bridge. All of that kind of stuff kind of is from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. So I think it's definitely a good example of a rebellion. But yeah, in this film, it doesn't quite have the ending you want. And I think we talked about V for Vendetta when we did this film as well, didn't we? That was the other one we paired with it. And that was another good example of a rebellion. But I think with that one, we were sort of like in two minds, weren't we, as to sort of, was it a good rebellion or was it just a bit much?
Yeah, or was it just a bad film? That's the problem there.
It's a shame. But a better film would be Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Yeah, with a brilliant rebellion, mostly headed up by Robert De Niro's Harry, as the kind of badass rogue vent maintenance guy, which is that his
just
like
an engineer, isn't he? He's like a gas engineer.
And of course, the actual kind of rebellion. I'm actually trying to remember now. Is it? I can't even remember. It's not real, is it? Or it sort of exists, but as it's depicted on film, that's all just a fantasy at the end of the movie. But hey, it's a good rebellion on screen, isn't it?
Yeah, the big sort of moment at the end. But the thing is, the rebellion sort of continues anyway, because people like Robert De Niro's character are rebelling against this society where everything is led by forms and legislation. So they are rebellious just in their nature anyway. That he's like, I'm just going to come around, I'm going to fix your boiler and your air conditioning because I'm not going to fill in these forms because I'm a rebel. And I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, he sort of embodies two different types of rebellion at once. There's the traditional, like, taking up arms against the oppressive government rebellion, which we do see in fantasy form at the end. And also just behaving out of the box as he does in his day-to-day life, which is also a big middle finger up to the powers that be, the bureaucracy.
So what are you thinking for this one then, Matt?
For me, it's Hunger Games. You know, I don't mind being split over my feelings towards Katniss and the movement she inspires. I think it's great. I love I was doing the little salute. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think Hunger Games is definitely in there. And I think it's sort of seeing the way the trilogy pans out, where it's got that kind of like real powerful ramping up of the rebellion. And the Hunger Games is all about the rebellion, isn't it? Because you've got all of the different sectors which are being oppressed and in different ways leading up to the capital, and just the sort of how monumentous it is when they do invade the capital. So I think I've got to agree with you. Just looking at the bigger picture, it's one of the best rebellions, surely.
Yeah, let's give it then. Hunger Games is the best rebellion in the dystopia.
I volunteer as tribute. I believe we have a volunteer. Mr. Mayor. I need to get out of here. You need to get out of here.
No.
Go find Mom.
No.
Grim, go find Mom right now.
No.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Go find Mom.
No.
Grim, leave. Go find Mom.
No.
Dramatic turn of events here in District 12.
So next up in our Dystopian Film Awards is the Worst Dystopia to Live In category. And we've got some interesting films in this one, haven't we? And some depressing dystopias that I don't think either of us would want to live in.
Yeah, it's taken another downturn. But the four that we have chosen as the nominees for this category are The Purge, Equilibrium, 1984, and Children of Men. So a few that we've already talked about because they are pretty grim, heavy hitters, aren't they?
Yeah, and we've already said how being in The Purge would not be ideal for anybody. And even if you've got Ethan Hawke's great security system, it may malfunction as it did in the film, and then you'll be in a whole heap of trouble. So yeah, The Purge, I can see why The Purge is in this category, because it would be a terrible dystopia to live in. But it'd be all right for like the rest of the year. Would it be okay? Just the Purge day is the day where you don't want to be out?
Yeah, and if the Purge is successful in its kind of the reason it exists, then actually you live in a better society for the other 364, don't you?
Yeah, but I suppose it's whether you be spending the whole year just going, oh, it's Purge night's coming up soon. Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah, and if you don't have the money, it's going to be a pretty bad night for you.
Or you could have a really lovely time if you're into that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of that. Weird that you did.
Well, says a lot more about me than it does about you, doesn't it? But anyway, moving swiftly on, Equilibrium. So, Equilibrium, a world without emotions, basically. Everyone's got a pill, they're swallowing the pills, can't feel anything, everyone's just robots. Pretty bad dystopia?
Yeah, or is it? Because I guess, can you feel bad about living in that dystopia if you can't feel bad about anything? But it's just like a horrible concept, though, right? No joy whatsoever, is the cost of having no misery, I guess.
And also, they shoot dogs, don't they? in Equilibrium, just
yeah.
because they don't have any feelings about it. So they're just like, yeah, we'll kill all these puppies. That's pretty brutal. I don't want to live in a world where that's the norm.
And if you do have an emotion, you'll be dragged away and you'll have Gun Carter done at you.
Yeah, I mean, although having Gun Carter in the world's quite maybe.
You wouldn't be able to like it, James. You'd be dosed up on Equilibrium.
I'd learn it though, maybe, if I became one of the priests, one of the Gun Carter people. It's a lot of work though. Maybe I wouldn't want to live in that dystopia.
Well, I don't think you'd want to live in 1984's bombed out, miserable England of the future, would you?
No. They do get a lot of gin though, don't they? But it is terrible, terrible gin.
I don't like nice gin, and it didn't look like it was nice gin in 1984, so I got the impression it was basically petrol. That was their sort of means of escape. But you can go off into the woods and have a sexy little tryst with a rebellion lady.
You can, but you will.
And then you both get killed.
And you will get thrown into Room 101 and have unspeakable things done to you. So, yeah. And also, like, that little sordid apartment that they have in there as well. Like, all of that. Like, the
sex cauldron.
Yeah, the little sex cauldron place. Like, that's the only place that they can hide out and be intimate together. So, yeah, that's not ideal. The bit I think I referred to it as looking a bit sort of like Coronation Street with the cobbles outside. I mean, yeah.
But, a much worse Coronation Street.
Terrible Coronation Street.
Yeah. So how about Children of Men then? There's something, I mean, it's incredibly bleak, not to the extent of 1984, but there's this bleakness of this gradual end of the world just encroaching onto everybody.
Yeah, I think it's that, and I think it's the impact of not having children around. Like, whether you want children or not, there is something about having children that brings out sort of like maternal and paternal sort of instincts in people, and just not having any of that, I think that's quite a bleak world to live in.
Yeah, so what's your pick then for the outright worst dystopia to live in?
Oh God, this is difficult, isn't it? I think like any dystopia is a bad dystopia to live in, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But I think like we said, with The Purge, I'd be worrying about it all year, but it would just be one day I'd have to get over. Equilibrium, you'd be dosed up anyway. So 1984, I think, is probably the bleakest, just because it's so all-encompassing as well. Like the idea of Big Brother, they are always watching you. You can't have any sort of like personal life, and you can't... Yeah, I think it's just, for me, 1984 would be the worst one, because it is incredibly bleak.
Yeah, I agree. There is no ray of hope. We discussed a little bit how there may be a little ray of hope at the end of the book, but that does not translate into the movie adaptation. There really is nothing good happens, and any ray of hope is snatched away from the characters. So, yeah, I agree. That is absolutely the worst place to be in a dystopian universe.
Yes. No 1984 for us, but you get an award.
Thought crime is death. Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death. I have committed, even before setting pen to paper, the essential crime that contains all others in itself.
Our next category today is the most hopeful ending. So it's not the worst dystopia to live in, because there is a ray of hope at the end of the movie. And what are the nominees for this one then, James?
Well, this is just full of all sunshine and rainbows, really. Well, it's not. There's hope at the end. So we've got... There's a glimmer of hope at the end. So we've got Children of Men, Metropolis 2001, Logan's Run, and Idiocracy.
So, Children of Men cropping up time and again in these awards says a lot about the film, doesn't it?
Very, very good dystopian piece of cinema, isn't it?
But I feel like we were a little unsure about the ending of this film when we talked to Rihanna about it, weren't we? Like, just how hopeful really was it? It certainly feels hopeful in the moment, but what's actually going to happen to all of these characters in this society?
Yeah, there's still like a touch of dread about it all, because they end off hopefully sailing off into the sunset, into this magical place where they're going to be able to live free of all of the crazy societal stuff that's happening everywhere else, and the rebellions and the wars and whatever's going to happen to England after they escape. But yeah, I think it's still got that dread, like I said. So I don't think it's 100% hopeful. I mean, it's rare that you get 100% hopeful in a dystopian film anyway.
And crucially, Theo finds hope, doesn't he? Theo finds something to be hopeful about.
Yeah.
And it's Theo's journey. He's that great protagonist that we talked about earlier. That's the hope. Whether or not humanity is still doomed at the end of the story, Theo decides humanity is worthy of hope, whether it gets that hope in actuality or not. He finds something worthwhile, I think, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think that is the key to that film as well, isn't it? It's just sort of like his sort of like redemption as a character and his regaining of hope by the end of it. So another sort of instance of that is Metropolis, the 2001 Metropolis, the anime version, which we chatted about in our anime special. So this sort of like, this film ends with a hopeful note, doesn't it, amongst all the destruction of the Metropolis?
Yeah, well, what's destroyed is bad, basically. It's a giant, it's the ziggurat, this giant weapon that's going to destroy all life, I think, I seem to remember, or destroy all robot life.
It's going to do some bad stuff.
It's definitely going to do some bad stuff, and that all comes tumbling down. And this one is, you're talking about sunshine and rainbows, this one literally is, isn't it? It's like, it's this beautiful, sunny, hopeful day, and is it Kenichi, the young character, is that his name, I think? The nephew character of the investigator, Kenichi, that's it, decides to stay behind in Metropolis because, like Theo, he's found something to hope for. And I quite liked the generational divide as well, that he's kind of the young character and he wants to stay there with the robots and build something new.
Yeah, and I think it was so interesting looking at that film in particular as well, because it's a film from Japan, and when we talked about it, we were talking about how Japan has dealt with like intense destruction from sort of like nuclear bombing and things like that, and how they've had to rebuild as a country. And I think all of that fed into Metropolis and sort of like the mythos around it, which I think was a really interesting aspect to that film, which gave that hopeful end and that sort of sense of rebirth and rebuilding just a different layer, which I think we haven't had from many other dystopian films.
So what about Logan's Run? Now, this was one of a very small handful of dystopian films where we saw the complete destruction of the oppressive dystopian regime at the end of the film. And I suppose we do in Metropolis as well, but Logan's Run, the world is flipped on its head by the end of the film in a positive way, in a really hopeful way, even though, again, we did talk about how maybe all the characters will die because they've got no source of food or support. But crucially, the problem with society is upended and removed.
Yeah, you've got this really hedonistic society running out of a broken wall or something like that at the end of Logan's Run, and they're sort of like escaping this city, and then they meet for the first time in their lives an old person, and that's kind of like hopeful as well, the fact that they're going to be able to become old people because they haven't got that restriction on their lifespan anymore. That's hopeful, isn't it?
I think so. I think definitely, yeah. And lastly, we have Idiocracy, the very funny, maybe problematic Mike Judge movie, where in the end, we have literally the smartest person in the world becomes the president of America. But there's like an asterisk on the end of that sentence, isn't there?
Yeah, he's the smartest person left in the world, isn't he? Because everyone else is quite idiotic, as the title suggests. But yeah, there is something hopeful about that, isn't it? Because it's like a return to people using their brains and not demeaning people for trying to be intelligent and trying to learn stuff. And it's like a change in the society, which I think is the hopeful aspect of it, isn't it? Because they're doing something different.
Yeah, it's like a best possible scenario at the end of Idiocracy. We've got this bad situation in society, and by the end of the film, the best thing that can possibly happen to that society happens. And, you know, asterisks or not, that's undeniably hopeful for them. Exactly.
But then the pimp gets reanimated at the end as well, which is like a bit of a question mark as to what's going to happen next. But that's a terrible part of the ending. The rest of it, quite hopeful.
So what is your favourite, or what do you think is the most hopeful ending, James?
Oh, out of those ones, just because it is sunshine and rainbows, I think it's Metropolis for me, the 2001.
Yeah, I'm sort of leaning towards that in a kind of like I feel like it can't not be that, because there are so many caveats around the other ones, whereas it is explicitly good news, we're on to something better, and things are going to be better at the end of this film. Everything else is like we've got concerns about whether everyone's going to die, or just, or it's sort of like best case scenario out of a bad bunch. I think Metropolis is just explicitly good news at the end of the film.
Yeah, exactly. It's something hopeful to end on. And it was funny that was like one of the last films that we looked at. One of the films which, the film which has won the most hopeful ending.
Well done then. It's Metropolis for the most hopeful ending.
Uncle? I think I'd like to stay here for a while, if that's okay with you.
Okay, we're almost at our final category, the best dystopian film. But before that, we should have a recap of what we considered to be our hidden gems of this series, films which we hadn't seen before, which we really enjoyed and weren't expecting as well. So what films really sort of took you aback this series then, Matt?
Well, like I've put 2 on this list for me, and I feel like this is going to be a bit cheeky because these films are not hidden from anyone. They're kind
well-known gems.
Enormously, well-known gems. But for me, and we talked about them on the episodes, I'd never seen or read 1984 or A Clockwork Orange, and I read both of those books and I watched both those movies, and I had a just incredible experience with both the books and the films. So, in the spirit of like this discussing films that we didn't know before and we've discovered through doing the series. Yeah, for me, like it's those are the 2 big ones for me. But also one that I think was for both of us was Never Let Me Go. Neither of us had seen that. We talked earlier, just such a huge emotional impact from that film. It was incredibly well made, incredibly moving. That was a big one for me as well. And what else for you? Was a big discovery for you, this series?
Well, yeah, like you said, Never Let Me Go was a great one. And I think the other one for me was ZPG, Zero Population Growth, because we ummed and ahed as to whether we were going to cover it on this series. But it just offered something a little bit different to what we'd seen before. And it's a great sort of 70s sci-fi, which again is definitely it's the epitome of like a hidden gem. It's one of those films you wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards. Not many people talk about ZPG, do they? But I think I really enjoyed it as a film.
Yeah, it was a cool one to watch, definitely. Yeah, and in the spirit of this category, I'd never heard of it at all. It just popped up on our searches. But it was kind of like it matched up well with films like Logan's Run, even Zardoz, the culty kind of aspect of that, and THX as well, which is a much bigger, more famous film. But it slots in nicely with those kind of memorable 70s dark sci-fi movies.
That's it, and it's the whole thing about dystopian overpopulation, how you deal with that. And with that film, it was just saying no babies for 30 years or whatever it was, and just like all of the stuff that happens from that. And I think all of that has really sort of, again, fed into the other films we've talked about throughout the series. But I think the other film, which you introduced me to for this series, which I wasn't expecting, was Playtime. Now, it doesn't seem like a dystopian film going in, and it's a lot lighter than some of the stuff we've looked at throughout the series. But I had a lot of fun watching that, and it's Jacques Tati that did Playtime, isn't it?
Yeah, brilliant film. I'm so glad we got to squeeze it in. I'm really glad I got you to watch it. I love this film. It totally hits on the dystopian notes as well. It just approaches the topic in a totally different way to anything apart from modern times, of course, which we paired it with. But their approach to that kind of a concept is obviously different, because it's just straightforwardly silly, humorous, and slapstick, which is unusual. We did see it crop up again. We saw humour in Idiocracy. We saw some slapstick in Sleeper from Woody Allen. But yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and I'm I'm glad we got a chance to talk about Playtime.
Yeah, and it was a great opportunity, like we always like to do on this podcast. It was a sci-fi film with a different kind of genre attached to it, because obviously sci-fi can be comedy, it can be action, it can be drama, it can be all of these things, it can be horror. But it was great to look at a film like Playtime, which is a comedy which has those sci-fi elements, and just seeing that and getting to talk about it and having a break from all of the dark, depressive dystopias, the greys and the darkness in all of the other ones we've looked at.
So, I mean, is this just a tie across the board? These are the films that we enjoyed discovering the most this series?
Yeah, I think so. I think all of them added something extra, and I'm very glad that you were able to watch 1984 and read it, and the same with A Clockwork Orange, because yeah, I can't believe you hadn't watched it since. But again, it's one of your hidden gems. It's one of those DVDs you've got.
To me, yeah.
It's something you've got in your collection, which you're like, I need to watch that at some point. It's hidden away. Let's bring it out. Let's talk about it.
There was me. That is Alex. And my 3 droogs. That is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. And we sat in the Korova milk bar trying to make up our razoo dogs what to do with the evening.
I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone corrupt.
Well, I ought to suit you then. I'm corrupt to the core.
We don't go outside the boundary, Miss Lucy. It's too dangerous.
Dangerous?
There was once a boy who had a big row with all his friends and then ran off beyond the boundary. They found him 2 days later in the woods, tied to a tree, with his hands and feet cut off.
What do you call this?
Library Security Chief, Department of State Security. I'm going to ask you some questions.
What's necessary?
Barbara, hurry up.
I'm coming. Oh, come on, girls. Wait till you see how modern it is. And they even have American stuff.
So let's move on to the main event, the last category that we're going to be talking about today. It's the best dystopian film.
Oh, it's a tense category, and we've got some great films in the mix. So we have Children of Men. Of course, we had to have Children of Men in the best dystopian film category. We've also got Never Let Me Go. We've got 1984, which has come up time and time again throughout the series. And a film which we haven't mentioned so far, but one which is close to both mine and Matt's hearts. It's Verhoeven's Starship Troopers.
Oh, yes. This is a difficult one, James. This is very hard. I mean, Children of Men, first of all, it's been in like half of the categories here for our favourite things. It's so interesting, it's so compelling, moving, scary, thought-provoking. You know, it's a brilliant piece of filmmaking as well on top of all of that. Like, it's just very well made, the long takes, the editing, you know, the very subtle CGI. It's an absolute belter, right?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those films that is now a go-to when you talk about dystopian fiction. Like, everybody brings it up, don't they? Like, Children of Men has just become sort of, I would say, our generation's big dystopian sort of film.
Yeah, definitely. It's a modern classic of the genre, or just, you know, simply a classic of the genre.
Yes, definitely a good one there. And also a film which we've just mentioned in our Hidden Gems, Never Let Me Go. Now, this one, again, it offered something different to a lot of the dystopias we've seen throughout the series, because it was just the emotional elements of it and the way that the actors sort of conducted themselves. And it's just it's a sad and sweet story of something which is incredibly tragic as well. So I think all of that made it such a great film.
Yeah, there's a few, you know, it's quite rare that we get to watch a film with this much of just an emotional gut punch to it. And that's what I enjoyed so much about this film. It's, you know, it's like, it's almost up there with stuff like Graveyard of the Fireflies or Graveyard of the Fireflies?
Yeah.
The
very hard
Ghibli film. Yeah, very hard to watch, but like unforgettable, like the sort of emotions that it conjures in you that I think will stick with me for a long time. I really want to read the book of this one. I have got it on the shelf. I'd like to see if Ishiguro's book is as moving as the film is, because it's there's a lot from the performances that the actors bring to it. But just a great film to talk about. And also I like that it's one of our hidden gems. We hadn't seen the film. We didn't know a lot about it. And it's good enough to feature as a nominee in our best dystopian film.
Exactly. And again, another, like Children of Men as well, was a book before it became a film, and Never Let Me Go is doing the same thing. And so is the next one in our list, 1984, one of the biggest, if not the biggest dystopian book turned film ever. What a story that is.
Yeah, and we couldn't not have it as a contender for the best dystopian film, could we? Because we have been talking about it almost every episode. We've said the word dehumanization every single episode this series, and we've referenced 1984 at least every other episode. It's the bedrock of this genre. Really, though, I mean, really, it's Orwell's book is the bedrock of this genre, because a lot of the films we talked about came out before the movie did. But as I said before, it's a faithful adaptation. It's a very good adaptation, and just a very powerful, scary, horrible film.
Yeah, and I think it's the imagery as well, like both from the book and in the film we looked at. That aesthetic has been used again and again. It's that kind of world that they create in 1984, and like Brazil's so similar to that kind of world, and so many of the other films which we've explored throughout the series. So I think, it's only right that we had it in this category.
And then finally, another book adapted into a film, as so many of the great films we've watched this series have been, is Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. But this one, flipping the book well over on its head and completely reinterpreting the book,
Backflipping, somersaulting all around the book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Literally, like Rico in that scene in Starship Troopers when he's playing that weird sort of sports, the NFL thing or something, flipping around people and later flipping across bugs and stuff before shooting them all up. But I mean, what a film Starship Troopers is.
What a film, what a satire. My favourite of Verhoeven's satires. I prefer it to RoboCop, although they're both absolutely massive films. But this is so good. We talked about it at length with Becky when we talked about it, but the sort of journey of being like loving it as a kid who just wants to see an action movie and then growing up and understanding satire, like what a journey to go on with a film and completely change your interpretation of a film and still enjoy it as much or more even.
That's it. And seeing all the dystopian sides of it now and just sort of like how that society is working, like what it takes to be able to get the right to vote. You have to have been in the army or you have to be a certain level in the society. All of that kind of stuff is just so interesting to look at amongst all of the really fun action scenes and fighting aliens and all of that business going on.
So I've been struggling with this one as we've been talking, but I've come to a conclusion that I'm pretty happy with it. So what's the best one out of these four? I mean, I'll just tell you, I think it's Children of Men. I think it's the best made film out of these. My heart wants to go with Starship Troopers, and the experience that I had reading 1984 was amazing. But I think looking at this list of four, the quality of filmmaking at work in Children of Men stands head and shoulders above the rest for me.
Definitely. I've got to agree with you, because when we chatted about that film with Rihanna, like we were talking about Alfonso Cuarón's sort of the way that he put the film together and how intricate it is and how all of the shots work and what they add to the story and all of this stuff that's at play in that film, and it really takes you on a ride as well. Like all of the action scenes that happen in it, the dramatic storytelling, it's just so well crafted, I think. And as we said sort of a few minutes ago, the fact that it is kind of that big dystopian film of our generation that came out. Yeah,
it picks up, 1984's legacy, and I think it can stand shoulder to shoulder with 1984 as important a piece of fiction in this genre as 1984, and that is saying an awful lot. It would be saying an awful lot about any film, but Children of Men shoulders that responsibility very easily.
Yeah, well, I think that sums it up then. Children of Men is the best dystopian film of the series.
I'm scared. Please help me.
Well, that's it, isn't it? We have covered Dystopia on the podcast. We have journeyed through the weird and wonderful world of dystopian fiction, and got to give a shout out to some of the other films that we didn't nominate for any of the categories. I mean, films like Mad Max, we watched Rollerball, What Happened to Monday. There's so many here. The Warriors, Blade Runner 2049, Repo Man.
I finally got around to watching Blade Runner 2049, another amazing film. Yeah, so many great films. And Brazil, rewatching that after a long time was amazing.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, and we've had some fantastic guests joining us this series. So a big thank you to everybody who has joined us to chat on the podcast this series. So thank you to Mike Munzer, Kevin Lyons, Rob Watts, Dave Bradley, Richard Edwards, Tanavi Patel, Becky Dark, Alan Stroud, Rihanna Dillon, and Tiffany Angus. What an amazing array of guests we've had this series.
Thank you so much to all of those people. You've all been wonderful. You've all really lifted up this series. It's been so fun talking to all of you. It's been you all kept us on our toes as well. I've really enjoyed the episodes where we've had guests. You know, like it's such a different dynamic to when it's just you and I, James.
Definitely. It's really helped to open up the conversations we've had around these films, just getting different voices in and hearing sort of other perspectives on these works of fiction and all of that kind of stuff. And also a massive thanks to everyone who has listened along the way this series and joined us for our journey through dystopias. It has been a pleasure having you along for the ride, and we hope you will be back with us when our next series comes out. In a little bit. It won't be too long, will it, Matt?
Yeah, we're going to put our feet up for a little bit and take a well-earned break. And we need that break because it's been pretty depressing talking about dystopias. But to lighten things up, next series, we are picking things up again and talking about some exciting, fun movies. And it's going to be a lot more joyful, I think, right? What are we doing next series, James?
Yeah, I think it'll be a lot brighter next series. I think we're going to be getting away from the dark greys and disturbing natures of the dystopias we've looked at this series. But let's do a little drum roll.
I'll get my big drum.
To get the big drum, and then I'm going to announce what we're going to be doing next series. We ready? That's some great drumming, Matt.
And that's it, James.
We are going to be doing space opera.
Yes.
Yes, the controversial space opera, space fantasy. We are going to be delving into that in our next series.
We're flipping from the very depressing, very realistic, believable science fiction of dystopia all the way to the other end of the spectrum to the very fantastical, very unbelievable space opera worlds that we're going to be visiting. I'm very excited to talk about these films.
Yeah, and there's going to be some big films that we're going to be covering in the new series. We've already got a list. We're getting everything together. So we're going to be working on that, getting that prepared. And so, yeah, watching some great space opera films.
Yeah, so feel free to send in your suggestions. As James said, we've got a substantial list that we're going to be working through and organising into a series. But we welcome any more suggestions that you've got. What are your favourite space operas that we need to check out? We got the big hitters on there, but feel free to say them again in case we don't got the big hitters, right?
Yeah, I want to know what our next hidden gems are going to be that we're going to discover on the new series. So yeah, please do send in your recommendations. And as always, if you want to get in contact with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have a website. We've got a Facebook discussion group. We've got TikTok videos now promoting some of the episodes. They're everywhere. You can find us. Just look up Journey Through Sci-Fi. So at Through Sci-Fi or at Through Sci-Fi Pod, and you'll be able to find us, have a chat, and speak to us.
We'll be quiet on the main feed for a while we take a little break and prepare our next series. But if you want some content from us while you're waiting for that series, come and join us on Patreon, patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi. There will be no break. Content for the patrons. They demand it, and you can join and demand it as well.
Yes, so come along and join us on Patreon if you want to keep getting that amazing audio content for your ears. But if you don't want to join the Patreon, you could always leave us a lovely review on your podcast app of choice. And in your review, why don't you tell us what would be your best dystopian film of the series? Let us know. Do you agree with us? Do you not? tell us.
But that's us signing off for Series 5 on Dystopia. Join us again for our next series on space opera.
Thank you and goodbye.